listening, I encourage you to go to churchdismantled.com and find the fun. And once it's posted, I'll add it to the blog post for this too. So you can just click through if you're on one of those apps where all my links show up when you scroll underneath the play button. So thank you tons, Conrad. I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to it. Whatever point we actually end up in the same place at the same time.
That'd be wonderful. Be part of the same community. But
yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And I really love your passion, vulnerability and storytelling and stuff. And it's very hardcore to tell a church. Yeah, I'll come back. As long as I don't get paid. All right.
Tripp, thank you so much.
That was fun.
It was a lot of fun. You are very engaging, and I appreciate that. Greetings, friends, and welcome to the podcast, A Church Dismantled, A Kingdom Restored, a podcast about some things that God just might be up to in the world, the church, in my life, in your life, and in the language of our guest today, Tripp Fuller, in the kingdom that is around us. Welcome, Tripp, to our time together. Tripp is most well known, perhaps, for his podcast, his longtime podcast, Homebrewed Christianity, his book Homebrewed Christianity, a series, but there's some other books Tripp has written. Tripp is currently at the University of Edinburgh with a postdoctoral research fellow in theology and science. Tripp, why don't you start by just telling us something we don't know about you that my listeners might be interested in?
Well, let's see. My wife and I are both ordained Baptist ministers. We have 3 kids. I'm very into like Lord of the Rings and Lakers basketball. I read comic books with my kid, my oldest, my middle child, our daughter. We have dance parties to really cheesy 90s pop songs on a consistent basis. And our youngest, who just turned 5 today, Haven, is like an old man. Like he like prefers just to sit and cuddle. And our other 2 are just so high energy. We just think, where did this guy come from? But he's super chill. And for his birthday, he asked for me to make him a pancake, but without syrup on it, so he can dip it and sit in my lap.
Wow.
And so that's what I did today.
Wow.
I cut it in strips, and we sat on the couch, and he just like dipped it in the
Tripp.
Yeah, he's a cutie.
Oh, that's powerful. When we're with our kids, nothing else matters, right? I mean, the other stuff just kind of melts away. You're a busy guy. How do you maintain balance in your family and your professional life and your studies and all of that? You just talked a lot about your family, so clearly they're important to you. How have you worked at that?
Well, I mean, one thing is in our almost 20 years of marriage, Alicia and I, one of us has worked and the other hasn't more than maybe 10 hours a week for 16 years of it. We both grew up in homes where one of our parents was always home. And once we had kids, we knew we wanted one of us home a majority of the time. And so because of that, it gives, now that early on, it was Alicia who was the primary earner. I was doing my master's, and then she did her master's, and then we had Elgin, and then I did my PhD, and then I started working and writing a dissertation and stuff because she was home at that point. We had our second kid, and we've rotated, right? And so like doing that has meant I have the flexibility of fitting in the weird things, like we're talking late at night. And so I'll do like a lot of podcasts and recordings late at night, and I'm happy to get up early and all that kind of stuff. But we basically kind of structured things so that when the kids are out of school until they go to bed, we're all, as often as possible, all the adults are at the house hanging out with kids. So I stay up late and do things. Some nights we're recording, other nights reading and writing. And then I do all the university things during the day and boring emails and that kind of stuff. But I mean, you're right. Like I knew I wanted to be a dad before I knew I wanted to get married. Yeah. And because I wasn't sure about kissing at that point, but I knew I liked the idea of being a dad. And I think we've always organize our lives. Both of us are oldest of multi-children homes. And so that's what we wanted to do. And we joke about, because we're thinking about our 20th anniversary, like there are plenty of years we weren't sure we were really good at being married, but we're pretty confident we've been good at being parents. But
well, you figure out how good you've been at being married when the kids leave the house, right, Tripp?
Yeah,
that was one of the toughest times for my wife and I in our marriage, and we really had to sort out what it meant to be we without the kids being there. But we're loving it. But it takes some time to sort that out because the kids are so important. And thanks for sharing that with us, because I think so often when we get involved in kingdom work, we lose a perspective on what's really important. So I just, my wife and I were separated for 2.5 years early in our marriage. God brought us back together. Thankful for that. So I just care deeply about how people are doing in that area of their life, because I think if you lose that, you lose everything, you know.
I found, and I mean, I say this because we're doing it currently, but like if you follow when we're really good at having our weekly no one else with us check in, and like the time, you know, if there's something important, you can bring it up. Like just doing that has made the biggest difference in our relationship, because then I don't have to make sarcastic, passive aggressive response as I'm walking out of the room earlier rest of the week. And that kind of thing, because I'm like, oh, no, I know we're both going to sit down, say everything we need to say, and then hang out. And it's weird to know how effective just making that space is, to then how good I am at talking myself out of it being necessary.
Amazing, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I regularly encounter reminders of my depravity. But
yeah, well, thanks for your vulnerability and honesty about those things. Tripp, I love people's biographies. I love the biography of the saints, and we're all saints and sinners together. Tell me how you got to Christianity, homebrewed Christianity, and where you are now relative to that when it came out. So has your trajectory changed? Are you going in a similar direction? I mean, some pastors, preachers only have one sermon. How did you get there, and where are you at now? And as you're reflecting back on what you wrote and what you've shared.
Oh, so the Homebrewed Christianity Guide to Jesus, I wrote. So I got that book series, the Homebrewed Christianity Guide series, after I was ABD, so all but dissertation. And the idea of writing books you get paid for versus ones 6 people read were really exciting. And so that I like that book. I hadn't read it in quite a while. Right now, Diana Butler Bass and I are running a reading group where it's one of the texts. And so it's been long enough that I was like, wow, this isn't bad, Tripp.
It's good stuff. I told you I read it at 3:30 a.m. this morning. So hey.
I was like, oh, I like this. And it was funny. Some of the stories in it I've told and will keep telling, since then. Other ones I remembered, like when reading, I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that conversation. Like the guy that, was trying to make space for Jesus in his heart bit. I forgot about that, remembered it. And then I went and looked the guy up on social media to see how he's doing. But after that, I wrote my dissertation, which was a philosophical Christology. It came out sometime in lockdown. I don't know the exact date at this point. Called Divine Self-Investment.
Yes.
And then after that, a lot of my academic research stuff has been around the science of consciousness. So that's what my larger research project right now is on. There's been a revival in philosophy and in the science of consciousness around different kinds of panpsychisms. And so the last 3 years, COVID obviously interrupted some of it, but have been working with scientists and philosophers around consciousness studies. And then, for me, there's a separate project of what a panpsychist philosophy of religion, because that was my primary area. I did a joint philosophy and religion PhD program. So much of the classwork and qualifying exams are philosophy of religion related, basically. And that's been real exciting. If people listening heard our previous conversation where I was interviewing you, one of the things where, there's this connection point was us, like our shared frustration in the way conversations of meaning, purpose, and value have been kind of evacuated in the public conversation. As a philosopher of religion, there are kind of like 4 questions that our dominant kind of truth-seeking regime of scientism or whatnot have a real hard time answering, because we don't have, like, it's just beyond science to answer, like the origin of the universe. I mean, we can talk about a millisecond after, collapsing wave fluctuation in a vacuum, and then you have, like, Big Bang cosmology begin. We don't have a scientific explanation for the origin of life. There are kind of 3 dominant competing theories, but none of them explain exactly how the story of emergence from, the cosmic one, like quantum mechanics to solid state physics, if you think discipline wise, to chemistry. Then you get 3 generations of dead stars and gravity, and now there's like more of the periodic table made, and then life emerges, and then all the complexity of life, the emergence of life, the reality of mind, which is the one I'm currently working on, consciousness, and then value is the 4th one. So as a philosopher of religion who spends a lot of time right now, like engaging philosophers that are non-religious or anti-religious, and then the sciences, those 4 questions are real interesting to me, because they kind of insist that there's a thicker, richer account of the world demanded than we have. And we either can't get to explaining it using scientific discourse, or science understood as a tool isn't fit for answering those questions. That's like the larger current research project kind of stuff I'm working on. Go ahead. Oh, go ahead. No.
What draws you to that, Tripp? What's the why there for you?
Oh, I mean, I think two different whys. One is I wrote the first book when I was a minister in Los Angeles, and I was a rural Baptist preacher's kid.
Yeah.
And then end up in Los Angeles doing a PhD. And that's such a different world. I went from, I joke about, in rural North Carolina, religious diversity was the kind of Baptist you were, and we didn't trust the missionary Baptist. To in Los Angeles on my street, you had 6 different religions and multiple versions of Christian, and atheists and everything in between them. And California is a wonderfully spiritual place. The atheists are more spiritual than atheists you get the rest of the country. It's its own space. But I was constantly frustrated there about the inability for religious traditions to have the big conversation around values, meaning, purpose, and stuff in the public square, and then kept running into those that thought they were doing their religion well were really tending to the preservation of the religious system they were handed, rather than figuring out like how you actually hand off the faith in a life-giving way to the next generation. And then in what ways can we hand it off where they're more passionately committed to the right things rather than the wrong things. That kind of desire for survival was there. So in that, as someone that spent a lot of time thinking, like, as a philosopher of religion, part of my diagnosis, in a sense that drove me, was we don't as a culture know how to have the conversations that humans have had forever around campfires. And yet when we don't do that, other things get their desires done in us. Yeah. And so in that times when I read Secular Age by Charles Taylor, that was real shaping. It's also the time I spent quite a bit of time reading in other religious traditions, philosophers around those questions, and seeing like what are the things that they find frustrating with inheriting the wisdom from their tradition and then going, my own people don't even see the wisdom. And then I look at the world, I go like, whoa, economism and nationalism and all these things are perverting us as a species. Like, what do we do? And so finding, that, I mean, the four things I named, I kind of go, I think we should give an account of the world where we have a mystery big enough to admit that we don't know where we came from, right? Like, in the sense we don't have a complete story of origins, that we tell a version of the story where the very mystery of life that we're in is bigger than the story we tell about it, around the origin of life, that our experience of the universe includes our own first person consciousness, like what it's like to be us. And presumably you have one too, and other things as well. And yet most of our accounts of the world scientifically don't include that reality. Like, consciousness isn't included. And then if you look at what animates these stories we tell about what matters most, assume values have traction with the world. And it's really hard to get around doing this. So what was animating me was how, as a philosopher, can I engage in the public square in ways we start to, one, value the wisdom of different religious traditions, these conversations, but also host the campfire again, where as a community, we hear across difference of the other, but get to have these big questions, as opposed to thinking we honor each other by just silencing ourselves.
Yeah.
Because what happens when you silence yourself is then your children and your grandchildren don't know how to tell those stories and to form their lips around campfires to ask questions. And then you get the existential angst and creeping nihilism and all the other kinds of things that are there. So no one's asked me that question before. So I was thinking about it. I was thinking about the response as I was saying it. Didn't have a prepared one.
So, Tripp, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, this is this big cosmic story. And then I read Homebrew Christianity Homebrewed, Homebrew Christianity. And it's like, it's easily readable. So how do you take what you just said to me and get it in the hands of, the person in the pew, like your first book? Or what's your thought about, because this is powerful. I mean, this is really, it's really significant, because you're right. We're not passing on the story. Otherwise, or we're not passing it on in a way that has meaning to our children.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you plan to communicate this?
Well, I'm working on a book proposal, but who knows if it'll be good or not. But there are two things. One is in a class, like I teach philosophy of religion this semester, and in trying to get to in trying to provoke in our classroom, at the University of Edinburgh, that's predominantly non-religious, and then you have multiple religions making up the minority, like why this question's important. I asked them questions about how they work in their whatever, their other disciplines. The ideal kind of epistemology or way of knowing tends to be disengaged. And I know the archetype's like what a physicist does or a chemist does, right? Like, you succeed if you actually eliminate yourself from the observations and the data. And if you can you come up with a hypothesis and then it gets proven and all this kind of stuff, the knowing involves disengagement. I think that that's actually how you're supposed to do science, is to do that kind of thing. I think there's also a kind of, not necessarily knowledge, but wisdom, if you draw a distinction between the two, that involves engagement. There are some things you never understand abstractly at a distance, that it involves engagement. And so those conversations with students in the classroom are really to help them tell us a story of when they feel engaged and what do they come to know. Some of the obvious ones are like love. Most people have fallen in love. And if I told you, like, I'm telling Conrad the story about how Alicia and I met and then we fall in love and blah, 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 blah. I don't think like out of it, you're like, wow, that was an excellent discussion of love, Tripp. Now I'm going to have to invite Alicia over and see if I too can objectively demonstrate this, this love. Can you give me your wife's phone number? Like, that just doesn't, that no one has it. But when you hear the story, it can cultivate in you memories, attentiveness to the people that you love in your own life. When you told me about your kids, in your relationship with the students. I think of all relationships with students that are positive. When you talked about your son, like those kinds of things, what resonates, the truth of it that resonates when you're in a telling within me is about the places those deep connections exist within me. Right. And so I think a lot of times people think in our current age that religion, it wins by being a math equation. So we line up, think of like really crappy apologetics, evidence that demands a verdict. Yeah. And you line up a bunch of proofs and you're like, see, Jesus fulfilled it. So obviously you're going to ask him in your heart right now. And the atheist is like, well, what about this, and this? So obviously you're going to forsake everything and join, and you're going to read Richard Dawkins religiously. That's just not how it works. Faith is much more akin to a poem than a syllogism. It's much more like falling in love than explaining Pythagoras. And to me, that means that we're leaving a lot out when we think God and or religion is something you explain in that distance epistemology, in the ideal being the laboratory. And I have a joke that at least in the book proposal right now is like on the title, it's called Godsplainers. You're like mansplaining when people are like, oh, you're mansplaining. Godsplaining is even worse because now you have all the same all the same confident sweeping dismissals and unrequested advice and dictates, except it's not just about your life, it's about the ultimate mystery of existence. And the biggest godsplainers tend to be those who are fundamentalist about their theism or their atheism, the ones that think like, I'm going to tell you the truth and it's going to be so compelling you're obligated to get here, and they're the ones that get the most attention culturally, are someone who thinks that their deepest religious convictions or their anti-religious convictions demand from the listener like that you assent to it. And I think just as a philosopher of religion that I'm deeply Christian and value the beauty in other religious traditions, and there are humanist traditions that aren't religious, have traditions of value and such. That in all those contexts, if we think we're going to engage in discussions that are Godsplaining, then we're actually killing out the life of it. And in a lot of my work as a Christian theologian and such, it reintroducing it within the Christian tradition. When I kind of put on your professional philosopher of religion thing, it's how do I help frame our engagement with culture and the diversity of culture in ways we come to acknowledge again the deep reservoirs of meaning, truth, beauty, purpose, value, and stuff, and then become allies and creating communities and conversations that bring us out of it, rather than things we kind of repress, suppress, deny, and silence.
So, Tripp, I've said that it's the mainliners who already know they're dismantled, who've received my message about a church dismantled, and it's the mystics. It's the mystics who've got this sense of mystery. Max Weber 100 years ago was very concerned about the end of modernity leading to what he called the iron cage of rationality, that would lose all sense of humanity, of mystery, of mysticism, and that we would be locked into this, what he called mechanized petrification. I think he borrows that from somebody else. But, and he says the only way out of that is to reclaim the old ideals, the ancient ideals, or charisma, to break through, to see somehow prophetically and break through. So it sounds to me like that's the work you're doing, that you're up to breaking free, helping us break free from that which has captured us in the church and in our way we tell our stories or don't tell our stories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you bring up Max Weber, then now you're probably more familiar with this than I am.
Maybe.
But in the notes I took about Max Weber that then I remember. So I don't know if These are Tripp's versions of it during qualifying exams. But like in this process of secularization, there you have like the disenchantment mode, right? Like where the phenomenological experience of the person is in a more secularized world. So we asked, do you believe in God? And 500 years ago, they're like, what would that question mean? There's the two bits, like after that, he starts talking about rationalization, where our culture, there's an increased kind of expectation or demand for causal explanations. And if you are a philosopher, you realize like Aristotle's like, there are four kinds of causes. And if you're only going if you're only going for efficient causation, then what are the ones being cut out? And the big things are like the telos of something, the goal. What is it structured for? How anyway, the kind of rich there are rich counts of causation. They get removed because he's like, the rationality of modernity is one that instrumentalizes things. So the scientific method, once you kind of reduce the causation to efficient one, then it's like you get all the means ends conversations. And those are easy to do when the only thing getting itself done is efficient causation. But you don't ask means ends questions if there's a telos for something. Say a child when they're born, and you're thinking about how you engage the structure so that they have a rich network of community and family and support and all the village it goes into raising, all that kind of stuff. It's a different question when you don't have, the means in things, how we relate to natural resources. Maybe we probably wouldn't call them resources to begin with. Anyway, there's so many ways, right? Like that logic gets put in, and ultimately it makes us look at the world as what are the parts of the world we can calculate, and then we can control them. And to me, that it not only, he jokes about it being an increasing bureaucracy, which it does, right? And so that's part of the dismantling thing we need. But the other side of it is it has no space for the human predicament. Like if you're thinking of efficient causation, instrumentalizing, what can be calculated and all that kind of stuff, and then you go into a humanities department, the things that send people, like why we create art about, all that kind of stuff. What are the stories and rituals religious traditions wrestle with? So much of like the deep, thick part of being human are set aside, not because like it's required for you to do science. It's not the actual doing of science. It's the having a world whose imagination has been so fit to this one type of thinking that it then atrophies all the others. And I think that it's the atrophy that's been occurring that is, in some sense, my what animates me as a scholar. And go ahead.
Well, and who do you think's ready to receive this message, Tripp? And where are you expecting the soil to be ready, cultivated to receive what is a really rich message that you're carrying?
Well, as part of this, I've had, multiple hour-long conversations with a whole host of scientists that are working in consciousness studies. And when you're doing something like that and you have a philosopher come on, at some point you spend enough time with them, you aren't just making sure they understand how integrated information theory works or whatever. You want to know, like, why are they interested in this? And then you start to ask them questions about how they got interested in it. And like of the 5 scientists I've probably talked to, 10, 15 hours each over the last 3 years that are very invested in different research projects, all of them at some point tell the story that animates their research. They get like, when did they first meet truth? From Catholic altar boy to, like a mystical moment in nature to their relationship with a dog that died to some weird sense of dead grandparent being present to like all these kinds of things. And when they tell that story, if they're very kind of accommodated in a sense, right, to the to the very instrumental, calculable world that Weber's worried about, in a sense, like what coming. Then what they then start asking you about it, because they're like, you're a philosopher of religion, and I know you're also religious, and you're a minister. And how do you see this? Once they get to the point that they don't think I'm like a real religious imperialist, then you end up having the kind of conversations you have with your friends when they get honest and share. And they all say how little space there is for that within the academy.
Yeah.
And how nice it's been to have someone who, when those conversations come up because of stuff we're working on that, are part of a grant research project and all that kind of stuff, then all of a sudden they're like, oh no, you're really good at having these conversations. I was like, yeah, I was a minister for 15 years. I was like, we did this. And underneath that, right, like just with them makes me go, we need to figure out how to do this. Why is it like we're failing when the individuals whose jobs are training everyone about how to wrestle with the world, to understand it better, and all that kind of stuff are sitting there like with all this emotional, spiritual questions and insights and wrestlings, and they feel like that's not part of what they're doing. So to me, that has been it's been exciting. And I would say that theologically, the single thing that for kind of religiously interested secular scientists, it is the problem of evil that comes up all the time. And some of it is because of certain kinds of divine action and things, or omnipotence and still calling God good and stuff like that. That is constantly, for those that reflect all the time, the biggest thing. I have a friend that is a philosopher who's who we've we're like acquaintance friends. We've had like multiple long talks, and he's writing this book for a popular level, and he and in some sense he's like, well, I'm arguing for basically a God kind of like you do, but I'm telling everyone it's not religious, but it's not a theism, because most people think theism means like traditional picture of divine power, and that's so bad for the problem of evil. He's like, I don't know, people like, it's weird that you want to use the word God but don't believe that, like, people, that's not what people think, blah 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 blah. And so that's been the other thing that has kind of stuck out, is that the reason a lot of religious, say like religious imagery, stories, rituals or experiences people had early on and stuff, that doesn't appear as a viable way of processing the questions and intuitions and stuff they have, is they have a really good point when it goes to omnipotence and the problem of evil. And so I've kind of been growingly aggressive about that issue to Christians, just to go like, have you noticed in the last 100 years that probably 3/4 of the people that teach at mainline seminaries systematic theology don't believe omnipotence like you think, and it's changed dramatically, and there are historically lots of live options, so this isn't the case, and yet it's amazing once you give a different account of the God-world relationship, how many people haven't thought about it, then go, oh, now that that's a viable one, then what do I do with it? And anyway, so that's been kind of my initial thoughts, and just how what the learnings were. Of course, I've been doing this on while in lockdown. So it's like, instead of being in a lab, it's like, hey, let's talk on Zoom. So,
well, I'm sitting here thinking how few conversations I have outside my own discipline, and so how wonderful and engaging and rich it is to have this conversation with you at a different kind of level, but about the very things I'm concerned about. I mean, some of the things we were talking about earlier, and this lack of space we have in our world to be authentic humans and to ask these questions. So, yeah. Anything else you'd like to add, Tripp, about kind of what you're up to these days and kind of where you're headed?
I mean, I don't know anything specific other than like, I mean, the easiest thing to do is just go find the podcasting, or you can go to my website and stuff, and you can find out whatever I end up doing. But I do think when I think of your work and like that the church needs to dismantle things, a lot of times people hear the challenge to dismantle and then they immediately get defensive, because underneath it is the recognition that you've kind of accommodated yourself to things you can't. One of the things you mentioned, I think it was in the first half of this conversation, about students going back and doing, presentations on a family member from, a while back, be it older person they interview or they do all the research and stuff. I've been working on something for thinking about my own family. And I kind of picked it back up in 2020 during all the Black Lives Matter movement and such, and then the battle over monuments and that kind of thing, because I went through and read all the journals of Hiram Shaw Fuller, who was a delegate to the Confederacy from Arkansas, a slave owner, a Baptist minister, a whiskey grader, based on how much he got charged, a seemingly wonderful husband and father, a sergeant throughout the war. Like, he's a conflicted person in his own age. And there's certain things about him that are completely embarrassing, wrong, vile, and evil. And then I read diaries of his children, who only if he was one-on-one would he break rank on being the sergeant, dictator, angry one. And they find out he's extremely compassionate. And half the time he left was because he didn't want to see anyone cry, but it broke his heart to watch his kids hurt. And then I go, like, what does that mean? Right. And I think part of the dismantling is, like, as I wrestled with it, I had to make peace, right? That's part of me, and I'm inheriting that. And there are real beautiful things in it, and there's just real vile, ugly things. And being honest about it is kind of necessary for me to inherit it in a beautiful way. Because I hope, with, if I told multiple stories of just all the costly things he did for his neighbors. Mm-hmm. Now, there are a whole lot of people he did not include in the category of neighbor he should have. Mm-hmm. But I hope I can include more, but still have the ferocious tenacity. And that's uncomfortable for me to say nice things about him, knowing what he did. But then it's also uncomfortable to say, honestly, all the problems and evil that he was connected to, because he's part of me. And when I think of that whole dismantling task, I think, one, that look in the past helps us in the present. But the other thing is, part of the dismantling is recognizing that if we win as parents, our great grandkids are going to point out stuff we were blind to, in ways we were accommodated to sick, sinful, twisted systems. And what can we show them? Yeah. We can't show them the answers to that, because we are probably blind, just like other generations have been. But we can show them that we at least learn to grow with the perspective that we have. And we can at least model what it looks like to acknowledge vile, ugly things in your past, and to treasure the beautiful parts. And looking at our historical moment, it seems like you have to do one or the other, right? Give a fake version of the past so you can clap for the whole thing, or tear it down. And if you're in that space and your inheritance is complicated, then you feel like you're getting cut off from so much. And I think it's true. I thought of this because I'm thinking of my own family. But now you and I, as ministers, guess what we hear every time we talk about being Christians? The church has a very complicated past. Yeah. And we're both part of the free church tradition. Yeah. And you're a Mennonite. My dad's the bumper sticker on my dad's car says, when Jesus said, love your enemy, I'm pretty sure he didn't mean bomb them. So like,
Mennonite.
yes. So, I think when you sit in that space and you look back at church history, do you try to tell the story where you ignore it all? Or do you do the it's just insert, cover for whatever the big ill of the day is? I think that kind of hermeneutic of learning to acknowledge and wrestle with the ugly and receive and celebrate the beautiful is not just how we dismantle in the present, but it's also can become a model to a few generations from now when people have to do the same to us.
Yeah.
And that's that, like how you talked about earlier, that what does it mean for us to become partners with the Spirit in the work of dismantling and then raising up and bringing new things into being that are beautiful? One of the ways we can show that is doing the same with our own kind of, the stories we're inheriting that are in us.
Tripp, one of the things that I love about talking with folks like you, and tonight especially you, is that you frame it better than I ever have. So what you've shared the last 5 minutes, I've never framed in the way that you just put it together. And frankly, as I listen to you, it gives me hope. As I think about putting side by side what you just did as part of the dismantling process, acknowledging both kinds of stories, and finding the beautiful and also acknowledging the vile. And I think that kind of authenticity is what our students, the students I have smell pretense a mile away. I mean, they've lived in a so-called reality culture. They know BS when they see it a long way away. And what you just described, they are hungry for. I mean, they are really, that I think, yeah, that if we could incorporate that into our gospel story, into our story, it gives me a lot of hope. Thank you for the way you put that together for me and for my readers. That was really powerful. I don't know if you could restate it, but I'm glad I got it recorded because it was really, it really brought it to me, because I think people are hearing this message as only destruction and not the beautiful part of restoration. And the fact that I have to acknowledge I too will be looked at and dismantled down the road, even as I'm being dismantled now. Tripp, thank you.
Oh, I'm glad. Like I didn't know where this conversation was going to go, and you started asking really good questions. When I get ones I haven't thought about recently, and then it brings up stuff I've been thinking about, then you get to hear Tripp processing. Processing out loud.
That's the thing about these, isn't it? When with the host, I always learn more than I bring. So thank you. Where can folks find your podcast, Tripp?
Oh, just go to trippfuller.com, Tripp with 2 P's, or just type in Homebrewed Christianity. And I've been doing it since 2008. So there's a lot of things in around the internet. I'm easy to find. If you message me, the easiest way is on Twitter. Because I cannot keep up with messages anymore, but Twitter's the one that I tend to respond to the easiest. But yeah,
Tripp, thank you for being part of this. It's been a real joy and meaningful, rich for me to host you and to also be interviewed by you. Best to you and your family, and I hope things go well for you there in Scotland. You're able to get back to North Carolina, and God's blessing to you.
Thank you, Conrad. It's been a blast.
And listeners, thank you for joining us today. May you know that you are deeply, deeply loved and have the imprint of God upon you. Thanks, Tripp.
All right. That was fun. That was fun.
So fun. I'm glad it's not late here as it is there, but thank you for your for taking the time. That was really a lot of fun.
Yeah, and so what day do you put stuff out? Because I want to make sure I link to things
I usually,
It-
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, because what day works best for me to release it? Would you like me to do it tomorrow, or I could do it on Tuesday? And then I can always just add back in the link later once you post our conversation, because I want to make sure people have time to know about the webinar and stuff coming up.
Yeah, but you've got that the e-blast going out tomorrow for me, or not tomorrow. I don't know when it's going out, but remember,
Yeah, that's why I was saying I want to put the episode out so that when I send the email, like it's like you about the books in the webinar, but you're like, also you should just clearly go listen to his talk.
So what are your thoughts?
That's what I told Patrick when he had asked. He's like, oh, well, can you do it this week? I'm like, yeah, I think I can. And then when he sent to me, I'm like, well, he has a podcast. Then why can't I just have him on the podcast? Because the click-throughs are always better when like you get the email. Like if I post the podcast tomorrow and then send the email Tuesday morning, then a bunch of people have already downloaded the podcast. Others will be like, oh, I should go listen to it. And
what works
and
for
people, I mean, my thought is I'll put the podcast out tomorrow and then send the email Tuesday morning.
Okay. That's good.
That way if they have already listened, they look at it and like, oh, this is Tripp said they were sending this and about this. If they hadn't, then they can skim it and get an idea of what you're up to, and then it send them to look at the podcast and know about the books and stuff like that. So
sounds great.
Half the time he'll send me a message like, oh, well, this school wants to send a message or something like that. And I'm like, well, why don't you tell them, like, just send me whoever their favorite professor, like the most popular professor is. I'll talk to them. That's way more compelling than just like looking at an email.
I really appreciated this, Tripp. It meant a lot to me. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Anytime someone wants to is spending money to share the word, then there's obviously something someone cares about. And if they think you match for them, then I'm not usually worried that the conversation is going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And then the fact that you are an academic, but then, end up in a congregation context that comes from that to me is intriguing.
Yeah.
I love talking to, I love the interdisciplinary things. And that's my favorite part in being in a university is it's easy to find someone that knows way more than you'll ever know about something and then just talk to them about it. And then you get their like cliff notes in your head, think about it, and then you can come back in and check on it and be like, so here's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. It's wonderful. And by the time you get to my age, I don't care that they know more than I do, And so it's just like, tell me what you know. So yeah.
Yeah. And sociology has got to be a fun thing to get to teach with undergrad students.
Oh, it's huge. And the last 2 years have been, I've said, the richest time sociologically I've ever experienced. And certainly because when the world opens up, that's when sociology emerged anyway. And so when the world opens up, you see into these crevices like you never saw before. And that's what sociology is all about. And so it's been an incredibly rich time to help students to see structures that they were not seeing before COVID. I mean, they don't come in seeing structures. They come in just thinking they're in control. They've got all the agency. COVID taught them they have very little agency. Wow, what a rich environment to teach them. It's just huge.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you gotten into Hartmut Rosa? He's a German sociologist, and his new book, well, it just came out in paperback. It's called The Uncontrollability of the World.
Wow.
And his other books are ginormous.
Yeah.
His book on acceleration, I really, really, really like. And they had one called Resonance, and those are giant books. This one, short, but Uncontrollability of the World, like thinking is like a reflection on COVID, and it's around those type of things. Like what did COVID showed us is we had created a whole world as if we could control it. Like, and then that shows up. Then what else does it show us? It actually shows us we have the ability for collective action that we never admitted to ourselves.
Yes.
Like we were able to shut down and actually everyone still ate and all these kinds of things, right? And then you're going back to a world that created the crisis in a sense, and has a growing number of people living in despair, not having all this kind of stuff, and then go like, no, we were able to stop it. We can't control the world, but we did have a way of responding. Why are we going to turn back on essentially like the cultural dials of like accelerating culture and technology and all these kinds of things he had diagnosed before about like modern nihilism, when one, we aren't really controlling it, and two, we do have the ability for political action we didn't admit before. States did things.
Yeah. And three, so much of it brings death rather than life. And so why would we go back there?
I know. But it was one of the books I've been reading recently.
Title. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So and I was like, oh.
Yeah, that's so did that just come out, obviously, after COVID?
Yeah. And I'll send you this link. I got sent. Do you know Gerardo Marti?
I don't.
He's a sociologist of religion. He's at Davidson in Charlotte. He's been on the podcast a couple times. Like, he's a sociologist, but he also is at AAR every year. So that's the American Academy of Religion.
Right.
So he's the chair of the sociology of religion thing for that group. He was the one that first mentioned Hartmut Rosa to me, and then in lockdown I got into it, and I did one of our reading groups. Like Homebrew does these reading groups, like right now I'm doing one with Diana Butler Bass, the Jesus Deconstructed one. We did one I guess like a year ago that was on Charles Taylor and Hartmut Rosa. It was called Religion and the Spiritual Crisis, and I'd gotten into reading it. So I basically found a friend that's a practical theologian that read Taylor and Rosa, and we made a class so we could talk about it together, but I'll send you this link because he sent me this new lecture he did relatively recently where he kind of summarizes his big books, but also at the end talks about like COVID. And he even goes through like how it impacted his students and what he's been thinking about it. And what you were saying made me think of it. And I was like, oh, I wonder if they just have similar intuitions or, or if he's.
Well, one of my conversations, I'll close with this because I want to let you go, but one of my biggest conversation partners for the last 15 years has been an atheist, Jewish atheist, who just knows more about the church than almost anyone else because he's outside the church. And he's going to be on my webinar, Mike Schwartz. And I'm just, he talks about the rubber band that we just wanted to go back to what was. And we live in this world that just kind of pulls us back with the inertia it has. So I was just thinking of him while you talked, but he's been so helpful to me.
Mike Schwartz.
Mike Schwartz.
Schwartz.
Schwartz. He just writes little essays. I'll send you a couple of them. He's retired now, but wow, Tripp, thank you. So you'll send out the podcast tomorrow and the e-blast on Tuesday.
Yep.
Okay.
Awesome. It's been really good to get to meet you. And hopefully if I end up back in Lancaster for one of those intensives, I'll let you know so we can hang out.
Can I give you my cell phone?
Yeah.
717.
Hold on. Let me pull up so I can save it and it'll still show up when I get to America. Like I have to switch SIM cards, so I have to save it on the phone or. Yeah. All right. Go ahead.
717-669.
669
0074.
0074.
And I'm 15 minutes from Franklin and Marshall and from LTS. And so, yeah, that would be wonderful to connect. And best wishes to you and your family. Blessings to you.
Thank you.
All right.
I'm going to bed now because it's midnight.
All right. Thank you, Tripp.
All right.
Get some sleep.
Bye.
See you. Bye.